Welcome to another Beyond Clean Expert series. You're watching the Chemical Safety Expert series with Alex Hilliker. I'm your host, Bobby Parker, and on today's episode, we're taking a deep dive into the risks around hydrogen peroxide exposures specifically. Now, in previous episode, I believe it was our third episode that we recorded together, we talked about the evolution of chemicals and the modern chemicals that we work with in sterile processing today for sterilization, and hydrogen peroxide is everywhere. Just about every sterile processing department you go into may find one of these sterilizers in it. And so, Alex, the question for you today then is, because hydrogen peroxide sterilizers are more common because they were perceived to be safer, is an exposure, a hazardous exposure to hydrogen peroxide still possible?
Sure. Yeah, it absolutely is, Bobby. And I think that, as you referenced on a previous episode, we talked about how the rise of hydrogen peroxide over the past couple of decades, really over the last 30 years or so, to the point where it's now used in pretty much every hospital in the country. And it's been quite a journey for hydrogen peroxide. Just in 2024, if you can believe it, FDA announced that it now considers vaporized hydrogen peroxide as an established method of sterilization for medical devices. And in that announcement, they talked about and they recognized VHP's long history of safety and effectiveness over the last 30, 35 years. So let me start this episode and start this section by saying upfront and for the record that, in addition to efficacy, safety is absolutely a top consideration and a top priority for sterilizer manufacturers. However, as Amy says in ST58, sterilizers can and sometimes do fail. So we're talking about what to do when things don't go according to plan, what to do when things are unexpected, so that you can keep your teams safe. What this looks like in practice is there could be a leak of hydrogen peroxide from the sterilizer machine itself, or there could be what's called fugitive emissions from the chamber at the end of a cycle. And there's studies out there that have shown that sterilizers at the end of a cycle can emit and have emitted up to 20 parts per million or even more of vaporized hydrogen peroxide when the chamber door was opened. And keep in mind that the OSHA permissible exposure limit for hydrogen peroxide is 1 part per million over that 8-hour time-weighted average. And the recommended short-term exposure limit is 5 parts per million, according to ACGIH. And so when you combine that with the other thing that we talked about in a previous episode, and that's that the cycle time has been drastically reduced with VHP, that also opens up the opportunity for repeated exposure throughout the day for a sterile processing technician as they go throughout the course of their shift.
Right, because with ethylene oxide that may take, 8 to 10 hours to run a cycle, you could squeeze in 16 cycles or something like that for hydrogen peroxide. So yeah, certainly more opportunities, even if we're not aerating off the residual chemical out in the open room like we did at one time with ethylene oxide. So that's helpful. You also threw out some numbers around exposure limits, and obviously that number of 20 far exceeding that short-term exposure limit. I guess my follow-up question is, how big of a deal is this, Alex? Obviously, we don't think, or wouldn't want people to think, that it's unsafe to set foot in a sterile processing department unless they had their Batman tool belt of monitors strapped to them at all times. But it also sounds like there are some real opportunities to have some exposure. So I don't know, what would be the result of having a legitimate or dangerous exposure to hydrogen peroxide in a department?
Yeah, it's important to remember that, like ethylene oxide, hydrogen peroxide is a sterilant. It's designed to kill everything that it touches. It kills cells. It kills the bad stuff. It doesn't discriminate. It also kills healthy human tissue just as well as it kills pathogens. And so overexposure to hydrogen peroxide can lead to eye damage, respiratory irritation, even skin irritation when you handle the tray without gloves, without the proper PPE.
Hmm.
It's important, I think, for viewers to know and understand as well that hydrogen peroxide is a known animal carcinogen and it's a mutagen. And for those of you maybe less familiar with that term, a mutagen is a chemical that causes mutations or changes in our DNA. And so the long-term effects of exposure can be potentially concerning. Some organizations like, the New Jersey Department of Health, for example, they say to handle hydrogen peroxide as a possible carcinogen with extreme caution, and that exposure should be reduced to the lowest possible level.
Yeah, that's really interesting and enlightening to talk about. The thing, kind of the buzzword or the trigger word for ETO that makes it such a chemical boogeyman is that carcinogen piece. But
Mm.
it is interesting to note the compelling amount of research around hydrogen peroxide having similar risks, and at least in some respect. And so, thanks for calling that out. As we're thinking about using hydrogen peroxide in the home, part of the thing that I think makes it seem like not as big of a deal is because it's such a familiar name. Obviously, the little brown bottles that you can get from the supermarket, and put in your home. And then there's other industries that use hydrogen peroxide as well. How is the hydrogen peroxide that we're dealing with in sterile processing different from those other applications?
Yeah, hydrogen peroxide's everywhere. It's such. I think part of the challenge with hydrogen peroxide safety is that it is so common. You mentioned you can get it at the brown bottle in the pharmacy. It's in shampoos, it's in toothpaste, it's in detergents.
Right.
Really, the primary difference there, Bobby, is concentration. When you're talking about the brown bottle or those household items, you're typically talking in the neighborhood of 3%. When you compare that to 50, 70% or more in a VHP sterilizer.
Right.
So the brown bottle is definitely not what you're using in your sterile processing department. The concentrations are more similar to what you would find in rocket fuel than what you would find in your medicine cabinet or under your sink at home. So to summarize this conversation, Bobby, that there really are very real safety considerations to make when dealing with hydrogen peroxide. The absolute best way to do that is to understand in real time what's going on in your department and to see if there are, in fact, any acute or long-term exposure risks, and to make sure that you're putting standard operating procedures and technology in place to reduce overexposure to hydrogen peroxide to the greatest extent possible.
Well, I'm looking forward to diving into what some of those best practices and standard operating procedures might look like in a future episode. Next time, though, I want to do a similar deep dive into peracetic acid as we dive into the numbers and the health exposure risks related to that. But that's going to do it for today's episode of the Beyond Clean Expert Series. If you have any other questions around chemical safety or particularly around hydrogen peroxide, I'd encourage you to reach out to Alex directly. You can find his contact information in the description below. If you're enjoying this series and would like to catch up on the rest of the videos, you can find those over at beyondclean.net. Please stay tuned each month as these episodes are released monthly as we go through this chemical safety series. But until we talk to you again next time, keep fighting dirty.